Hey everybody, Fair Day here. Hope you're all doing well. Uh, so I'm doing a series of videos about the four worlds of the Hermetic Qabalah, or the four elements. Um, as Hermetic Qabalah looks at the world through the lenses of the four worlds, and and thinking about that a little bit in regards to magic and to the tarot. I already did fire, and the second Kabbalistic world is water. Um, I don't want to repeat too much of what I said in the fire video. It's probably best if you watch them in order, and fire is first. Um, just briefly, I'm trying to avoid using technical terms from the Kabbalah. People who are into the Kabbalah already know them. Um, People who are not maybe unwilling to go any further than this if they know there's going to be a lot of new strange words. I'm mostly just interested in getting out ideas. Ideas are fun. Um, just a brief revisiting of something that I said in the first one was that the idea behind the four worlds was to try and get a grasp on the infinite mentally, which is not really possible because we work our minds work generally by comparing one thing to another thing and saying what something is and what something is not, and by coming up with definitions for things. All of those things only work because those things are limited. Something is something or is not something. That's a limitation. um, and a definition is a description of something, and it does it in that terms. This is what it is, this is not. So we can't really come up with the definition for the infinite or describe it or imagine it. Um, the four Kabbalistic worlds was an attempt to do it anyway by sort of looking at it in four different ways. And it doesn't really work. It comes up with some great ideas that give you some insight into the infinite, but it doesn't describe it or define it or make it clear in any way, shape, or form. It throws off, and the attempt, though, does create a lot of practical stuff for use in magic, not the least of which is the use of elements in astrology and tarot. Um, the first Kabbalistic, and also the four Kabbalistic worlds are not literally worlds, separate individual worlds. They're just really four different ways of looking at the one world. The first way was fire, and that was the world of divinity. Um, God, the gods, goddesses, um, formless, huge. Um, One of the examples that I talked about was if you look at the deity Hermes. Um, Looking at him through the world of fire, he's not um, like a comic book superhero, looking just like a person with sandals with wings on him and a helmet with wings on him and a fancy staff, flying all over the place using superpowers. But he's everywhere where there is communication or interaction going on, where there's commerce going on, where there's movement from one place to another, um, which is huge. That the movement thing alone just takes place everywhere. Um, the second Kabbalistic world, water, is called the creative world. It's also called the archetypal world. And just looking at that same example of Hermes, if you look at him in terms of the archetypal world rather than the divine world, suddenly you've got imagery to work with. You've got the statue of the guy with the wings on the helmet and the sandals, and you have some picture in your mind of him. And we know on some level that he's not human, that he's bigger than human, that he's this huge thing. But in the archetypal world, we have this image to work with that allows us to get into greater touch. And through that imagery, we can maybe bounce ourselves from the water world to the divine world, from the archetypal world to the divine world, um, as part of our communion. Um, we'll talk about how to get in touch more closely with the watery world towards the end. Um, it's known as the creative world, and that has to do with the fact that it's conceived of as water, and water is something that takes a shape. In the fire world, the divine world, there isn't shape. Um, there's will. Something can be willed into existence through an act of divine creation, but the way it's going to look is based on the way it's conceived of in the water world, the way it's going to be. Um, One of the ways that it's looked at as is the fire world as being male and the water world being female, and that the male world provides this energy and the female world provides a womb that shapes it, or that forms a shape that contains it. Um, and in the Golden Dawn system of magic, they broke down different kinds of magic through, or it being more related to the specific world. So fire, they said, was evocation, which is summoning spirits or energies to do your magic with, or invocation, which is calling energies or magics or deities into yourself to do magic with. The magic that they listed for the water world was the making and charging of talismans. So it's less dependent on the direct connection with the divine because you yourself are crafting something. You're making an actual thing, and then you're taking that fiery energy and putting it into that thing, and that thing, as the vessel, um, with that shape, directs that energy in the ways that you want it to go for your magic to work. And as a symbol, water is very good for that sort of thing because it takes the shape of what you put it into. So um, many of us will have like a cup of water on our altars. And that's the water in that cup takes the shape of the cup. We talked about with fire how if you align yourself to the will, you are irresistible because nothing can resist the will. But in the water world, you actually can shape the substance of the world to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Although, again, it's since they're not separate worlds, you're going to want to take the fire and the water into account in your magic. The other thing, and water is so amazing and interesting in terms of creativity on so many levels. I mean, there's a myth of in Greek mythology, Poseidon, the god of the sea, wanted to be the king of the sea. When he and Pluto slash Hades and Jupiter slash Zeus um, rolled lots to determine who was going to be ruling what of the realms, Zeus won the toss and he chose the sky because it's the biggest. Um, Neptune slash Poseidon chose the sea, and he was happy with that because he would have chose the sea even if he'd have won the toss. Um, the sea was not the biggest of the realms, but he thought it was the most interesting because of the diversity of life and creatures in the sea. And another way that we look at water and the symbolism of water in Hermetic Qabalah and in magic in general is as emotion. And you can think of emotion as this vast sort of subconscious um, thing that has these powerful tides that come in and out and waves that lap the shore in a rhythm and that makes them sort of predictable. But it's really hard to account for everything that's alive inside of it. All the different kinds of fish and crustaceans and mollusks and corals and creatures of every size, shape, and form. And it seems like they're always discovering something new and weird that looks like an alien. And in a way, that's like our emotions within this great subconscious sea. And the water also stands for subconscious. Within this great subconscious sea, there's all these creatures that are our emotions. And as much as we can learn to predict the tides of the sea and our subconscious mind and our emotions and the rhythms, there's always going to be something undiscovered popping up at us that we maybe are unprepared for, unless we can be prepared for the unprepared, which I think we probably can. Although it's a lot of work and it takes a certain amount of time and you got to really want to do it. So I've heard it said that emotion is our primary connection to reality. And I think it may be true. I think that when we are confronted with something or encounter something or engage with something, our initial reaction to it and thoughts about it are probably almost always emotional. Um, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but I don't know that it always steers us correctly. Um, and my mother, God bless her, um, would have these reactions to people that were based on her emotions that she was sure were correct, and over time they would turn out to have steered her completely wrongly, that the person was nothing at all like her emotional reaction suggested. And yet she always had that thing in her mind where she had this feeling about them. Sometimes she was amazingly correct. She could be extremely intuitive, and she knew things about people that wouldn't turn out to be true for decades to come, but it turned out that she was right. But other times she was just completely wrong. The fact that she was right some of the time meant that she was unwilling to give things a second thought other times. And I can be that way myself, although I've learned to moderate that and be open-minded. There was a study during a presidential election maybe 10 years ago which sort of showed that voters do most of their voting based on emotion rather than on thinking things through. During the Great Recession, there was a study. Economists believe that in something called enlightened self-interest, which is that when people think about their money, what they think rationally, what I'm going to do with my money, what I should do with my money, how I'm going to invest it, how I'm going to save it, what I'm going to spend it on, that economics is a science that works perfectly. But the problem with it is that this study showed that people don't do that. People spend their money, save their money, invest their money emotionally. And that is unpredictable. It's like the sea, where you've got your rhythms and your tides and you got it all worked out, but then suddenly there's a giant squid, and we thought giant squids were extinct thousands of years ago. So what's this one doing here now? So although initially when we encounter anything, we might have this emotional reaction, and it is a connection to that thing. We aren't necessarily right about what that thing is like, but it lets us, it gives us a starting place. Another thing along those lines is very people seem to know that the word passion that comes from the Latin root that's the same as the word passive. People think of emotions as being very active, that they move us in one direction or another direction. But the idea behind passion being related to passive was that it isn't us moving ourselves based on a passion from point A to point B. It's that something else, the thing that we're passionate about, has control of us. That thing has grabbed us and is pulling us towards them. So passion is passive rather than active, because we're doing something for someone or something else, rather than something that originates in ourselves. I find myself through meditation that a lot of emotion rises up in us, and it doesn't always necessarily have anything to do with us. Given some occult theories on telepathy, it could just be stuff that's floating through the air. Emotion from other people. It could just be that emotion is this huge, Jungian mass subconscious mind that we're a little outlet in, and the tides bring in stuff from beyond ourselves. It could just be that so many of those weird, bizarre little fish are so deep down inside of us that we're not aware of them. So when I see them pop up in a meditation, I wasn't able to trace them deep enough into myself. But emotion can be sort of tricky. In some ways, the bigger something is, the easier it is to get a grasp on. I mean, the infinite is impossible to get a grasp on, but when you talk about the divine and the fire world, you can look at generalizations, and there are philosophers like Plato who do that, or the Kabbalah does that, and you can reason about things based on generalizations, but the emotional world is more volatile than that, because we don't know what's going to happen next or what shape it's going to flow into based on changing terrain and circumstances. And that's one of the reasons that I think magic is very attractive, because it gives us methods to contain them, and you can contain that power and shape it. And emotion is a power in magic. I mean, it is. Will might be what directs magic and makes the magic actually happen, but emotion is an energy that causes it to be, things to be the way we want them to be. Assuming, of course, that our will is tuned enough. And again, I mentioned Plato. Plato had this idea that you couldn't accomplish anything without emotion. He sort of divided us into the thought process, thinking, emotion, and body. And whatever we thought was the best thing to do, or whatever our body is telling us to do, is going to fail unless we are emotionally behind it. So one of the big things in some of his philosophy is getting emotion on side to accomplish things, because it's emotion that's going to move us to point A and point B. And the trick is for the intellect, rather than the thing at point B, to be the one to convince emotion to go that way. That's in his thought anyway. Not everybody thinks intellect is always going to be right either. it sort of requires a certain amount of balance to do things right, I think. Um, in any event, the the trick in getting a handle on emotion and on water and on creativity is like with fire. It involves communing with it, getting in touch with it, um, learning how to work with it. Um, for fire, I had mentioned that ways to do this involved evocation and invocation, and even though those are fiery magics according to the Golden Dawn, they can be useful in regards to um, communing and getting in touch with water as well. I mentioned in the last video that the fire elemental king Djinn was a good spirit for beginning evokers to summon because he's not hostile to humanity and he can teach you a lot of things. That is even more true of Nixa, the elemental king of water. He's friendly. Um, he's got enormous amounts of magics that he's willing to teach the witch or magician who gets in touch with him. Um, Water elementals in general can be sort of tricky because they range the whole emotional spectrum. Um, but if you've got Nixa on your side when you're doing that, or you take the proper precautions, um, they're relatively easy to summon and work with. Again, invocation as well. Any deities we mentioned. Or I was thinking about going with Venus rather than Hermes for the archetypes. If I had, I could say, well, she's very watery, so if you wanted to get in touch with water, she would be a good deity to invoke. Um, Ceremonial magicians who do things like the opening by watchtower or the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram um, have archangels and angels that they can invoke, and witches who call the quarters, who draw a circle and call the quarters, can have a source of watery energy to invoke and commune with. Um, for if that's a little more advanced, um, then the thing about watery magic itself is that it will help with that. So making talismans, doing magic through crafting. Um, Witchcraft 101 is learning to manipulate magical energy, and that in and of itself is water. That's communion with water. So for ceremonial magicians, things like the middle pillar or tantric rituals that involve moving energy around in your body. Um, all those sorts of things are good at learning to work with water. Um, and then, of course, there's meditating on the tarot, which will be the second part of this video. So let me pull up some tarot imagery here. Whoops. I guess first I gotta hit share screen. And PowerPoint. Let's see here. Go to slideshow. Oh, it's so slow. Slow, slow, slow. From the beginning. So to quote occult writer Lon Milo Duquette, it is, or to paraphrase him, since I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he says that it's often easier to see the powers in the tarot in the cards that are for large things more so than in the one for the large cosmic things, rather than the ones that are in the small, mundane day-to-day things. And that's because there's an admixture of other powers in the mundane. Everything that happens in daily life is a mix of a whole lot of stuff. The big picture for water is the Ace of Cups. He says that if you were to put the Ace of Cups under a microscope, what you would see would be the entire suit of cups. So my recommendations for meditating on tarot in order to commune with water and get insight into water is, if you're just starting out, if you don't already have a feel for it or for the tarot, start with the Ace of Cups, because it is pure water. It's called, in the Golden Dawn system, it's called the root of water. Which means that all other water sort of flows out of it. Once you have a little facility with water through meditation on the Ace, I would move on to the signs of the zodiac that have to do with water, and that's the Chariot, which is Cancer, Death, which is Scorpio, and the Moon, which is Pisces. Why is Pisces named after the moon? Why isn't it just the moon? Well, that's actually a very long story worthy of a video of its own. The moon is actually the high priestess. The one that is used to invoke and evoke water is Scorpio, the Death card. And you can see that there's water in all of these cards. You've got a river flowing behind Cancer, the Chariot, and a river and waterfall behind Death and Scorpio. And you've got the pool that the crayfish is coming out of in the moon. Unlike the Ace, the signs are not quite as pure. The red coloring in the Chariot points to just a little bit of fire there, and that circle with the wings is the sun, which is very fiery. The Moon card has those little flames dropping from the moon. Being on either side of Scorpio, you'd expect them to have a little more to do with fire, although even Death has the sun rising in the distance there. And there are some red flowers and symbols on the garments of the people who are dying. But meditating on these three, one at a time or all together, gives some insight into water and some communion with water, and opens the door for you to a more watery consciousness. There's something that I should say that I forgot to say in the fire video, and that's that when meditating on these cards, when you're first starting out, meditating on one at a time is not a bad idea. But eventually, you can meditate on them in combinations. And that doesn't even necessarily mean sticking entirely with the elements here. Like, suppose you wanted to meditate on the moon in Scorpio for some reason. You could meditate on the High Priestess and Death together. Or, Mars in Pisces. You could meditate on the Tower and the moon. Eventually, in attempting to commune with water and get a feeling for watery consciousness, you might want to lay out all of these watery tarot cards at the same time and look at them as water as the entire universe rather than as a particular picture of a certain type of water um, doing a certain kind of thing. And that sort of segues us into the suits. Um, the suit of cups is, of course, the watery suit, and meditating on these would give you a great deal of insight into water as it takes various shapes and does various things. There's going to be more of a mixture with other things because it's mundane. The king looks extremely watery. You can't just off the top of your head see a lot of admixture, although it's there. The king is also related slightly to fire. Queen is probably the most watery of these particular cards. The two of cups has a Mercury symbol. The three of cups, you can see all those pumpkins and fruits laying on the ground, vegetables, which are very earthy. There's a great deal of earth in the four as well. The castle in the back of the five also suggests some earth, as do the houses in the six. In any event, these are all significantly watery for our purposes. And the next slide I've got is in the last video, in the fire video, I talked about how there are other water cards other than the suits and the three zodiac signs and the ace, which are watery, and you sort of, there's a lot of them. You sort of have to search around and see what reads as water to you. I throw these three out as examples. The high priestess is the moon. If you look at her dress, it's water. She is water, and then the moon controls the tide. So there's a correspondence between the moon and water. She's often thought of as memory and the subconscious mind. And one of the things that I didn't mention in the first part of the video is that the subconscious, or the water, is often a symbol for the subconscious mind, which is why all those fish are living in it, all those thoughts and memories and emotions swimming around in the subconscious. Temperance is actually Sagittarius. We had him up in the fire because Sagittarius is a fire sign, although there isn't any obvious fire in this particular version of the card. There is in some other ones. In this case, we've got the solar disc on his head is fiery. His face is leonine, which is reminiscent of the lion in Strength, which is Leo, which is also a fire sign. That's a fire triangle on his chest, and that may be a volcano erupting in the background. But if you look at the growing flowers and his foot in the water and the water running between the cups, there's definitely something to do with water going on there that is worth paying attention to. The hangman, as I mentioned in the fire video, in the Hermetic Qabalah, the tarot cards, the major arcana, are broken down between the 12 signs of the zodiac, the planets, and there are three called the mothers, which are the planets that have been discovered since the Hermetic Qabalah was devised, and the three elements, water, fire, and earth. The hangman astrologically is Neptune, which is one of the outer planets not discovered when the Hermetic Qabalah was initially, and the tarot were initially created. And as a mother letter involving the element, the hangman is water. The only real clue to that is the blue garment that he's wearing. Um, there are some more esoteric versions of the deck where you can see the ground under his head, and there's sort of a ditch that his head is dangling into, and that ditch is considered to be a water gully, like in the spring when there's a lot of rain and water coming down from the mountains, water would be running through that little ditch, and his head would be underwater. But like the ace, the hangman is a sort of primal water elemental card and worthy of some attention for in meditation if you're looking to connect with water and understand water better. Um, and like I said, there's a lot of cards in the deck that might have water involved in them, but they might not be as purely water as some of these. So you have to go through and learn them and feel them. And lastly, I'll bring up the queens here. As I mentioned in the fire video, some of the cards, including the queens, all of the court cards, are considered to have a certain amount of admixture to them. So all of the queens have to do with water, but they also all have another element based on their suit. So the Queen of Cups is water of water because she's purely water. Queen of Wands is water of fire because Wands is a fire suit. The Queen of Swords is water of air because Swords is the air suit. And the Queen of Pentacles is water of earth because she's the Pentacles is the earth suit. This is also true for the 3s, 5s, and 8s. So the 3, 5, and 8 of cups would be water of water. The 3, 5, and 8 of wands would be water of fire, etc., etc., etc. This has to do with the card's placement on the Qabalistic tree of life, which is sort of beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. The only thing really left to say would be to reiterate the techniques of meditation, which I mentioned in the fire video. Just to briefly summarize those again, there is just looking at the card and trying to clear your mind and let the card make itself available to you. Another is to imagine that the card is the size of a door and to walk through that door, and then in your imagination explore the card from within the card, get different perspectives, interact with different beings, entities, or things that you see or encounter. And lastly, there is to become the central figure of the card. For example, if it were the Queen of Cups, imagine yourself to be the Queen of Cups. Look at the card for a while and then imagine every detail around yourself. Imagine the crown, imagine the cup that you're holding, imagine the throne. Fill in every detail until you see and feel yourself as the Queen of Cups. And then in both instances, in the door one and in the when you are the character, once you've actively used your imagination to set the scene, clear your mind and just see what happens. And it doesn't have to be a character that is like a person. Like you can meditate on the Ace of Cups, imagining that you are the Ace of Cups, the hand and the cup, and the water overflowing and the bird. You can imagine that you're all of those things. It's just a matter of the fine details of your imagination. In any event, that's my video on water. I hope you liked it. I would appreciate it if you left comments. Liking it would be cool too. And I will see you soon with a video on the swords and air. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. So before I started working on editing on this, I had a bit of a postscript on water. Similar to the last thing that I said on fire, and that's to look at water a bit in terms of modern chemistry. In modern chemistry, the states of matter are solid, liquid, gas, and energy, which correspond pretty closely to earth, air, fire, and water. Mystically speaking, as with the physical, water affects the other elements. Like if you combine fire and water, you get steam. How much depends on how much fire and how much water. Steam, you could argue, is water as a gas, or you could argue that it's air. In the tarot, pay attention to the clouds and see what impression you get from all the various clouds in tarot. The water itself is made out of combined atoms of hydrogen and oxygen, both of which are gases and would be technically air, and yet combine them and you've got liquid and water. If you pump some electricity through water in a controlled scientific way, you can break it down into a tube full of hydrogen and a tube full of oxygen. You put a match under the tube full of hydrogen, there's a popping noise, and the hydrogen seemingly disappears, and instead you will have some water. The oxygen burns brightly because fire is a process of combining oxygen with other elements, and unless there's hydrogen present, the oxygen will combine with something else, but if there's hydrogen present, it'll turn into water in combination with the hydrogen. And lastly, our body's like 75% water. Our skin is like a bag that's holding all this water. Which makes me want to close the same way I did with fire when I said, you are fire. You're 75% water. That's good enough for me to say, you are water. Take care, and I'll see you later.